Things you might like to know about. Queen Etheldreda and the portrait in the attic. After Queen Etheldreda fell in the river, she did not bother to try to save herself. Why should she? She was keen to embark on eternal life right away. She lay gazing up to the surface of the water, and soon she began to wonder why she felt so strange, kind of hollow and not quite there. Increasingly impatient, she watched the bottom of the royal barge as the bargee waited for hours, not daring to leave in case he missed her. Slowly it began to dawn on Etheldreda that Marcellus's potion had not worked. She was nothing more than a common ghost. Unaware that the potion had worked to some extent, and that she was in fact a substantial spirit, for it is hard to tell the difference at first, Etheldreda lay under the water, watching the shifting surface, and working up a temper. Etheldreda's temper was at the boiling point, when Marcellus Pye at last located his mother. And so it was that, 13 days after she had slipped into the river and drowned, Queen Etheldreda was called up by her son at midnight. Like a cork out of a bottle, Etheldreda burst from the black waters of the river, and kicking and screaming she flew through the freezing night air, giant snowflakes passing through her and turning her watery insides to ice. Still protesting, she was pulled into the small room hidden under the eaves at the far end of the palace attic, where Marcellus Pye and Julius Pike, the extraordinary wizard, were waiting for her. There, between the black and red robes of the alchemist and the purple cloak of the wizard, she saw the life-size portrait of herself and her eye. Etheldreda knew enough about magic to know what was about to happen, but there was nothing she could do. Despite her kicking and biting, punching and scratching, Julius Pike and Marcellus Pye dragged the substantial spirit of Etheldreda into her likeness, where she joined the eye, which Marcellus had captured and killed the previous day. They propped the portrait up against the wall and sealed the room, and there she and the eye stayed until Silas Heap unsealed the room 500 years later. Princess Esmeralda. After Marcellus had sealed Etheldreda into the portrait, and was sure that her spirit could do Esmeralda no harm, he went through the queen's way and told Esmeralda the news. At first, Esmeralda was pleased that she was no longer in danger from her mother, until it dawned on her that her mother was actually dead. After that, Esmeralda spent a long time wandering the Moran marshes, thinking about her mother and her lost sisters. She refused to come back to the castle and spent her teenage years living with Broda, but when the time was right, Esmeralda did return and take her rightful place as queen. Esmeralda did her best to rule well, although she never quite got rid of the nervousness brought up by having Queen Etheldreda as a mother. She married a handsome and very steady farmer from the apple farm just across the one-way bridge, and had 2 daughters, Daisy and Boo, who both became queens in their turn, for Daisy had 5 sons, but no daughters. After the great alchemy disaster, when for 7 days and nights she helped Marcellus with the sealing of the ice tunnels, Esmeralda developed a headache and spent most of her time in the small sitting room at the back of the palace, with the curtains closed, while the very capable Princess Daisy took over the palace. The crowns. For as long as there had been queens in the castle, the true crown had graced their heads. It was reputed to have been made from the finest and most magical gold ever known, the golden thread spun by the spiders of Arum. It certainly predated Hotep Ra, who had founded the Wizard Tower. But with the demise of Etheldreda, the true crown was lost, and Etheldreda's prediction came true. Esmeralda never did wear the true crown. But Esmeralda didn't care about that. The true crown was gone, and good riddance to it. Esmeralda wanted a brand new sparkly crown all her own, and in the fashion of the day, which was rather overwrought. Esmeralda was her mother's daughter, and what Esmeralda wanted, Esmeralda got. She was crowned in the throne room of the palace on a rainy midsummer's day, and then, resplendent in her new crown, went to see the dragon boat. The dragon raised an eyebrow at the sight of so many diamonds and gems, but said nothing. For some time Esmeralda would not be parted from her crown, and wore it everywhere, until she got a stiff neck, and reluctantly took it off when she went to sleep. It was this crown that many hundreds of years later the supreme custodian ran off with, leaving Jenna with no crown of her own, until the true crown rolled out of the bonfire and found its rightful owner once more. The Eye. Etheldreda found the Eye in the palace gardens when she was a little girl. The creature had jumped ship after realizing that the ship's cook was planning to boil it for supper in revenge for a nasty nip on the ankle the Eye had given him that morning. Later that night the cook became delirious, and the ship's crew went without supper. 3 weeks later the cook died, for the aye carried the sickness in its bite. But Etheldreda soon realized this, and found the aye to be a most useful weapon. Her mother was terrified of her new pet, but dared do nothing, for Etheldreda, or Etheldreadful as she was known, wanted the aye, and even when she was only 9 years old, what Etheldreda wanted, Etheldreda got. The aye was a long-lived creature despite many surreptitious attempts on its life by numerous palace servants. It was said that Etheldreda cared more for the aye than she did for her own daughters, which was, of course, true. The bumptious barrel of lard. Although the bumptious barrel of lard was not called that as a child, his own name was almost as bad, Aloysius Umbrella, Tiresias Dupont. His second name was a mistake on the part of the registrar at the naming ceremony, in response to a barked instruction from the infant Aloysius' father to his wife to take the umbrella off his foot. The young Aloysius Umbrella was an only child who always knew best. When he was 10, his mother, tired of being told how to darn his socks properly, secured a job at the palace for him as an under-messenger to the 4th secretary of the keeper of the royal door-step. There was no stopping Aloysius Umbrella. After that, he worked his way up through the complicated palace hierarchy until he was himself the keeper of the royal doorstep at the tender age of 14. At the age of 20, Aloysius Umbrella stepped in as deputy steward to Queen Etheldreda after the actual steward had been laid low by a mysterious bout of food poisoning, one of many he had suffered since Aloysius Umbrella had begun to sit next to him at the weekly servants' supper. The steward never fully recovered, and Aloysius Umbrella was offered the post full-time. Although Aloysius Umbrella was by then known as Bumptious, he did not acquire his full nickname until he had spent a further 3 years overindulging in palace food. After he fled the palace in terror, having slapped Queen Etheldreda, Aloysius Umbrella took the night boat to the port and left on the first ship he could find. He spent the rest of his days in a small town in a very hot, far country, where he worked as a drain inspector during the day, and spent his evenings carefully ironing the tattered remains of his palace ribbons. The True Glass of Time. In ancient times there were many true glasses of time, but over the centuries they became lost, destroyed, or, like Marcellus's glass, they disintegrated under the opposing forces of time. By the time Marcellus Pye was a promising young alchemist, all were lost. Marcellus read all he could find about the glasses of time. He discovered many things, that you needed a linked pair, and that whatever happens to one will happen to the other. He also discovered that when you walk through one, you find yourself in a place that has no time, and to go into another time you must go through the other of the pair. But nowhere could he discover the secret formula of time. Marcellus became obsessed with discovering the formula, and after 3 years of searching, he had a stroke of luck. One wet winter's afternoon, when he was meant to be visiting his mother, he stumbled across it in an ancient text, buried under a dingy stack of books at the back of the manuscriptorium. Marcellus memorized the formula and immediately burned it into the flame of his candle, for he wanted no one else to discover the secret. He soon regretted this, for the first 2 glasses he made did not work properly. They merely transported him through a solid wall, which, though marvelous in itself, was not enough for Marcellus, whose ambition was to move freely through time. Marcellus decided that even so these glasses could be useful. He locked each glass so that only his key would control it, and put them in ornate gilded frames. He gave one to his mother as a peace offering after one of their frequent arguments. Etheldreda did not care for it. She put the glass in her robing room and promptly forgot about it. It was this glass that Septimus was dragged through. Marcellus gave the other to the chief scribe of the manuscriptorium, who was a vain man and was thrilled to have his own looking-glass, an incredibly expensive item in those times. He did not realize that Marcellus was using it to secretly gain access to the hermetic chamber. This was the glass through which Jenna, Uller, and Septimus returned to their own time. After these 2 disappointments, Marcellus locked himself in his room and hypnotized himself until he remembered every last nuance of the formula for the true glass of time, or so he thought. In a daring innovation, Marcellus fused the pair of glasses together, and they worked. The true glass of time was huge, immensely fragile, and dangerous. After Marcellus installed it in the great chamber of Physik, he sent a number of scribes through, but none returned. After his best friend disappeared through it, Marcellus decided not to risk using it himself, and locked the doors. Now Marcellus was getting confident. He started to experiment. He wanted something light and transportable that he could use to gather secrets from the dark alchemists in the land of the long nights. After the passage of an auspicious number of days, 169, 13 times 13, Marcellus successfully made a matched pair of glasses. Keeping one at the castle, he secretly spent the other through the Queen's way to his wife, Broda Pye, with the instructions for Broda to get it into the port. Marcellus travelled to the port and supervised the glass being loaded onto his ship, but while he slept, his first night on board, the glass was promptly unloaded by the unscrupulous, debt-ridden captain and sold to Drago Mills as a luxury novelty glass. Unaware that he had been double-crossed, Marcellus travelled all the way to the lands of the long nights and did not discover the deception until the hold was emptied. Furious, he returned to the port, intent on reclaiming his property, only to find that it was impounded in warehouse number 9. Try as he might, Marcellus could not get it back. This was the glass that Jenna, Nico, Snorri, and Uller went into, and Spitfire smashed. The other glass from the matched pair, which Marcellus had kept in the great chamber of alchemy and physic, ready to take him to any time in the land of the long nights, was of no use to him. Marcellus put it away in a cupboard in disgust. Years later the cupboard found its way to the palace, where it was used as the undercook's coat cupboard. It was this glass that Jenna, Nico, Snorri, and Uller came out of, and stepped into Marcellus's time. After this, Marcellus made no more glasses. He decided he preferred gold. At least you knew where you were with gold. Hugo Tenderfoot. Hugo never forgot Septimus, and the time Septimus had spent patiently teaching him all he had learned about physic. After Sir Hereward had taken him home, and his mother had been so relieved to see him, Hugo realized that his family did care for him after all, and he became much more confident. When Marcellus Pye found Hugo reading a physic book when he was meant to be on door duty, instead of being angry, he took Hugo on as his apprentice. Hugo did indeed become a talented physician, although he never managed to cure Esmeralda's headaches. Snorri's mother. Alfrun Snorrelson came from a long line of traders, and so she was used to the yearly exodus of ships and traders to the small wet country across the sea. Every year after the first frost, and frost came early in those dark northern latitudes, the traders' barges would set off laden with furs, spices, wool, tar, trinkets, and trifles. They would not return until well after midwinter feast day. Alfrun Snorrelson always knew when her Olaf would return, and as the time drew near, her friends would begin to ask, "Alfrun, Alfrun, can you see the ships yet?" And Alfrun always could. But the year that Olaf Snorrelson went away for the last time, when Alfrun's friends asked, "Alfrun, Alfrun, can you see the ships yet?" Alfrun shook her head. Even when the fleet of traders' barges had appeared on the grey wintry horizon, still Alfrun shook her head, but this time in despair, for she knew that her Olaf was never coming back. Alfrun gave her baby daughter the name that Olaf had chosen, and named in his letter of charters. No matter that Olaf had been convinced that his child would be a boy, Alfrun honored his wishes and called the baby Snorri. Snorri grew up surrounded by various aunts, uncles, grandmothers, and cousins. She was a happy, bubbly child, and it was only when, at the age of 13, she found her father's letters of charter naming Snorri as his successor to trade, that she became dissatisfied. Snorri had never given her father much thought before, but now she longed to sail in his path, tread in his footsteps, through the castle of the small wet country across the sea, and most of all, drink Springhouse Special in the fabled Sally Mullins tea and alehouse, and as a spirit seer, she also longed to see his ghost. When Snorri told her mother of her intention to trade in the coming season, Alfrun Snorrelson was aghast. She told her daughter of the dangers of the sea. She told her she was too young to trade, that she was a girl and girls did not trade, and besides, what did Snorri know about the price of fur and the quality of woolen cloth? Snorri knew nothing, but she could learn, and when her mother found her stack of traders' manuals shoved under her bed and threw them into the tiled stove, Snorri took Uller and stormed out of their little wooden house on the harbor, and went to the Alfrun. Her mother guessed where she was and let her be, thinking that spending a cold night on an uncomfortable barge would bring Snorri to her senses, and she would be back in the morning. But by morning Snorri was sailing out on the ebbing tide. She caught the southerly wind, and was soon heading down the coast to pick up her very first cargo as a trader. Alfrun Snorrelson was distraught. She sent a fast pilot gig after Snorri, but there was a brisk wind that morning, and although the rowers of the gig had sight of the barge, they had no chance of catching up with it. Her daughter was gone, and Alfrún Snorrelson blamed no one but herself. Snorri's father. When Olaf Snorrelson knew that he and Alfrún were expecting their first child, he was thrilled. He took his letters of charter to the League office and insisted that they name his first child, Snorri, as his successor, and then, promising Alfrún that this would be his last trip until the child was old enough to go with him, with a heavy heart, Olaf Snorrelson set off to trade. He arrived late at the castle of the small wet country across the sea, and did not get a good pitch at the trader's market. That night Olaf went to the Grateful Turbo, one of the trader's favorite hostelries, just outside the castle, to drown his sorrows in the way that northern traders traditionally did, and as a consequence was banned from most castle hostelries. Returning alone across the one-way bridge, Olaf Snorrelson stumbled and hit his head on the parapet. He was found, dead and frozen, the next morning by a farmer on his way to market. The ghost of Olaf Snorrelson lingered at the bridge for a year and a day, as all ghosts must do at the scene of their entry into ghosthood. He chose not to appear to anyone, but a nasty chill settled over the bridge, and many people claimed to feel quite depressed after crossing it. The Grateful Turbo Tavern nearly went out of business, as people became reluctant to cross the one-way bridge after dark. As soon as his year and a day was completed, Olaf Snorrelson wafted away to the Hole-in-the-Wall Tavern, and there he stayed. The Alfrún. The Alfrún languished at the quarantine dock all through the long winter months, where she acquired the forlorn air and the damp smell of neglected boats. When Jenna found out where the barge was, she asked Janet Martin to bring her to the castle boatyard, but before Janet had got around to doing it, the Alfrún was gone. Wolfboy. When Wolfboy left the Alfrún, he paddled across the river and found Sam Heap laughing at the sight of him frantically turning the paddles at the pink paddle boat. He got a warm welcome at Camp Heap, where the other Heap brothers lived, and despite the endless variety of jokes about his taste in boats, Wolfboy was pleased to be back. However, he was disappointed that he could persuade none of the Heap brothers to help him find Septimus, knowing that his own skills as a tracker were not going to help him find his old friend 412, for there had been no trail to pick up. Wolfboy decided that Aunt Zelda would have the answer. He took his much-derided pink battle-boat down the river to the port, and then set off along the causeway which led to the Moran marshes. Here Wolfboy's tracking skills came in useful. He followed the trail of the Bogart and arrived safely at Aunt Zelda's, where he discovered Jenna, who had just come through the Queen's Way to return the silver pistol to Aunt Zelda. Wolfboy stayed with Aunt Zelda. She stopped trying to teach him to read and began telling him about the things he really wanted to know, about the moon and stars, herbs and potions, and everything to do with White Witch lore. Wolfboy was an eager and talented pupil, and it was not long before Aunt Zelda began to wonder if it would be possible to break with tradition and nominate Wolfboy as her successor as keeper. Lucy Gringe. Lucy Gringe arrived safely at the port in Nico's rowboat. It was nearly midnight, and she tied the boat up to the harbor wall, curled up in Simon's cloak, and tried to sleep. The next morning Lucy bought a pie from the harbor and dock pie shop. Maureen, who owned the shop, noticed how pale and cold Lucy looked, and offered her a place by the fire in the kitchen to sit and eat her pie. Lucy was ravenous and bought 2 more pies in quick succession, plus 3 mugs of hot chocolate, downed everything, then fell asleep by the fire. Maureen left her to sleep, and later that day Lucy returned the favor by washing the pie dishes and serving in the shop. Maureen liked Lucy and was grateful for the help. She offered Lucy a bed in the corner of the kitchen, and her keep in return for her efforts. Lucy accepted, glad of somewhere warm and friendly to stay with a steady supply of customers to ask if they had seen Simon. To Lucy's disappointment, none of the customers had seen Simon, but late one night when she was sitting by the dying embers of the fire, Lucy saw a rat in the corner, nibbling at the crumbs that her broom had missed. Lucy liked rats, and did not chase it away as she knew Maureen would want her to. She watched the rat for a few minutes, and then whispered, "Stanley?" The rat looked shocked. "What?" it said. "Stanley. You're Stanley, aren't you?" asked Lucy. "Remember, I fed you biscuits after Dad locked me up. You're a bit fatter than you were then." "You're none too thin yourself, Lucy Gringe," Stanley retorted. And this was true, for Lucy did not hold herself back on the pies. And this was how, at long last, Lucy Gringe found her way to Simon Heap, for Stanley, ex-message rat and member of the secret rat service, knew where Simon was, although it took many talks at cross purposes, and many long hours of listening to Stanley's reminiscences, before Lucy discovered exactly what Stanley knew. The big freeze had already set in when Stanley at last agreed to take Lucy to the Badlands, and it was not until the spring of the following year that they actually set off. By late spring, Lucy and Simon were reunited at last.